your source for everything paranormal. Para-X. The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
It's always time for the dead to shine in Hollywood. The legendary Dearly Departed Tours has stepped up their ghostly game by offering the Hollywood Ghosts and Legends Walking Tour. Dearly Departed has long been an orb of hope in the paranormal world, having been featured on television's Haunted History and Haunted Collector. Their terrible tales have been made infamous in Marla Brooks' The Ghosts of Hollywood books. The new Ghosts and Legends Tour is a 10-block, 70-minute dusk-time stroll down the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. You'll be guided through the golden age of Hollywood and see where the unearthly Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney, and the calamitous Black Dahlia are still said to linger. You'll see Hollywood's Gothic hotels, legendary theaters, and restaurants, never forgetting their permanent occupants. No stranger to investigations, Dearly Departed Tours has first-hand knowledge of some of these hauntings. For details of the Hollywood Ghosts and Legends Walking Tour, find Dearly Departed Tours on Facebook, dearlydepartedtours.com, or call 1-855-600-DEAD.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron here on the Para-X Radio Network. The song you just heard was called I've Got to Find a Way. And that's kind of germane to the topic tonight because the late Forrest Ackerman, the notorious science fiction icon and also notorious atheist, actually did find a way from the other side. And he did it through my guest tonight, Paul Davids, who is an author, an award-winning Hollywood writer, director, producer of many TV films, including Showtime's original TV movie Roswell, Jesus in India, and the Life After Death Project, which is kind of a compelling exploration into the very real possibility that life after death does exist. And his latest film, Marilyn Monroe Declassified, will soon be released. And he's also co-author with his wife Hollis of 6 books of the Star Wars saga for Lucasfilm. Now, Paul's latest book, An Atheist in Heaven, The Ultimate Evidence of Life After Death, co-authored by Gary E. Schwartz, deals with what happens when a steadfast atheist, in this case, the world-famous futurist and pioneering promoter of science fiction books and films, Forrest J. Ackerman, dies, and discovers that he was wrong about life after death. Now, although Forrest Ackerman never believed in the afterlife of the soul, the spirit of the mind, or the spirit or the mind, he promised a few respected colleagues that if it were to turn out that he was mistaken, which he sincerely doubted, then if it were possible, he would try to send messages from the beyond. And so he did. Paul found himself receiving amazing communications from Ackerman since his passing in 2008. This is going to be a really, really interesting show, and if anybody in the chat room has any questions for Paul as we're going along, please send me a private message, and I'll pass it on. And in the meantime, Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, Marla. Thanks for inviting me to stir the cauldron.
Oh, you do it so well.
I never intentionally, you understand.
Oh, of course. I don't do it intentionally either. Right. There goes my nose another inch longer. All right.
I always stumble into it. In this case, An Atheist in Heaven is not a book I intended to write, planned to write. If you'd asked me when I was a teenager would I ever write a book called An Atheist in Heaven, I would have said, you probably got the wrong author, the wrong future author. But, life leads us in some very, very strange directions. And I knew Forrest Ackerman from the time I was a young teenager. I grew up back east. I made amateur movies back when all we had was 8mm, no video. And stop motion of dinosaurs and dragons and skeletons come to life and that sort of thing, under the inspiration of Forrest Ackerman's magazine, which, all the boys read back then and some of the girls. It was called Famous Monsters of Filmland.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, it is still published. It's different in character now. It's gone color, glossy pages, and Forrest is, the posthumous editor-in-chief, in title, as a sort of honor, but he's not around to give it that firm dose of puns and humor that always made it so lively and wonderful. So why this big lead up? Well, I knew Forrest for about 50 years. I studied in New Jersey at Princeton College there, and then went to the American Film Institute. And I've had a long career, as you mentioned, in the film business. And Forrest was always there in Los Angeles. He had this 18-room house. He called it the Ackerman Mansion. Absolutely filled with the memorabilia of science fiction movies, all the props, everything he could get his hands on. Every lobby card, every poster, any book a movie was based on, it was all there. Ray Bradbury called it the Fort Knox of science fiction, because that's where the gold was in those days.
Right.
In these days, people like Guillermo del Toro have the gold. Right now at LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, they have this enormous display of the collection of director Guillermo del Toro, who did Pan's Labyrinth and many other movies. He has a great collection of science fiction, statues of Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft and paintings and, all this kind of stuff that is just a feast for the eyeballs, particularly if you like that kind of horror stuff. But back in the day, Forrest was the go-to guy to see the collection, and he had open house on Saturday. Anyway, I knew him really well. And, I think he helped me in my career in many ways. And I loved the guy. He was an atheist, as you said, and he made no secret about it. He broadcast to the world, I'm going to be an atheist to my dying day. I don't believe in religion. Why anybody waste their time on all that quackery? So why would you want to take anybody seriously who believes any of that nonsense? That was his attitude. And I said to him, I think it was around 3 years before he passed at age 92, 3 or 4 years, I said, Forrest, that's fine, that's what you think, but what have you given any thought to what if it turns out you're wrong? Well, the way you had put it in the introduction to the show, you said, he promised a number of close people that if he turned out to be wrong, he would communicate from the other side. It wasn't exactly quite like that. It wasn't a serious, I'm going to have a go at it. It was done more with humor, and it was more of a snide remark that, I'm not going to be wrong, but just in case I do wake up to the great sci-fi convention in the sky, I'll meet up with, Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and Peter Lorre. I'll be very busy, my wife Wendane. I probably won't have time for you guys for quite a while till the party dies down. But maybe, if the party dies down at some point, I'll try to drop you a line. He said it with a snicker, you see.
Sure.
And a wink. So nobody really expected that it would happen. But boy, did it happen, Marla. Boy, did it happen. And it kept happening for years, these strange things that happen. And I want to make two things clear. Two things. First, in the book An Atheist in Heaven, I started with an affidavit, a sworn statement. It's all true. I want everybody to know, from the bottom of my heart, this is a true account. None of these weird things that are like out of the Twilight Zone that you'll hear about in this book are made up. Nothing is exaggerated. I wrote the book to go on the record with this account accurately and to do it also for science, because I got science involved in these studies. So that's the one point. The other point I wanted to make is that I never had any expectation or anticipation of any of these things that happened. It wasn't like channeling. I've seen channelers, who sit down and quiet the room and burn incense, and then they start speaking in a strange voice, and they're maybe channeling some alien from some planet or so. Who knows? Or some ancient Egyptian wizard or holy man. Who knows? This is not what we're talking about here. Not at all. We're talking about specific, identifiable things that related to Fari that happened, some of which just shouldn't have happened by the laws of physics. Just
there you go.
Impossible. Others of it would be in the nature of astonishing coincidences again and again and again and again that relate to him. And then we did have what we call instrumental transcommunication. And my co-author, Gary Schwartz, very famous in this field. He's written a lot of books studying life after death.
Yes,
Professor, University of Arizona, Tucson, has a Ph.D. from Harvard, taught at Yale, psychology. He studied instrumental transcommunication, which is using our instrumentality, which has only been around for about 100 years or less in many cases, whether we're talking about a tape recorder or a telephone or a computer, or a video camera, using the use of our instrumentality by unseen spirit to come through to us and let us know of its presence right here, right now. So that was part of it. And then mediums, some really good ones that Gary had tested in the laboratory, part of the whole university project. So when you put all these different types of evidence together, especially the absolutely clear physical evidence where there's a contact and evidence is left behind that science can study, it's, so An Atheist in Heaven documents all of this. Took years to write and put it all down. And this is after I first made a film about these things where you could see the mediums. You went into the laboratories with me and saw the scientists at work studying the data. And that was called the Life After Death Project. Easy. These are, at Amazon. That came first. And then 3 more years of work, and we had An Atheist in Heaven. Came out. So that's my story. I'm sure you have questions.
Oh, I've got a lot of questions because it's really fascinating. But I think the first thing I was chuckling as I was writing this out, this is an incredible book full of things that will make even the most inflexible doubting Thomas scratch their head. And so here, all this stuff is playing out. Do you think that the discovery that he was mistaken after he passed caused him either a great deal of consternation, or might he have just sat there and scratched his own head and found it quite amusing?
Well, I think amusing is one word, but I think amazement is another.
So he would have been amazed, yeah.
I think he woke up to a much greater reality than this. That's what one of the mediums said, that he had never imagined that it was all, as big as it is, as vast as it is. And so, I'm assuming now that there are all these different dimensions and that consciousness exists on many planes and many spheres and it all interconnects. So I think that he also wanted to correct his mistake. he wanted to let some who he was really close to know. And I had the opportunity to speak to the great author, Richard Matheson, before he passed away. And the interview was filmed. And he wrote the book, What Dreams May Come. Became a movie with Robin Williams about the afterlife. He'd given a lot of thought to the subject, and he did believe that life went on. He believed that spirits do contact people through dreams, that many of these dreams are not dreams, and that he had such a contact from his mother when she passed. But he said to me, after hearing the evidence of my case, and he knew Forrest very well, he said he absolutely believed that Forrest was correcting himself, that he was reaching out to set the record straight and let me know, that he'd been wrong. And hopefully by coming to me, I'm a media guy, right? He also went to Canadian documentary directors and made a movie about his life story. So he went to people who would sort of broadcast this in their own way, who would take the evidence very seriously and would want other people to know. And that's the position in which I found myself, because I've been up against skeptics in many, many ways, for much of my motion picture career, because I always pick these topics, that rankle the skeptics, right? Get their feathers ruffled.
That's how you do it, yes.
I am used to being attacked. So whether we're talking about Roswell, which I did for Showtime,
right?
The flying saucer crash in 1947,
Yep.
which all of my experience and research on that case tells me absolutely it did happen. And that whatever you've heard from officials to the contrary is disinformation. They've worked very hard for people not to know about that. So that was one area been attacked a lot of times. Jesus in India. I made that film about the missing years of Christ. The Bible only takes us up to age 12, the New Testament, and then it skips 18 years, and then it carries on at age 30. So it's a valid question. What happened during those 18 years? Was he sitting around at Joseph's carpentry shop making tables and chairs? Is that what was happening? In India, they believe he took the Silk Road to the Orient and lived among Hindus and Buddhists for a number of those years, and then that he came back to Judea to begin his preaching mission. Well, I asked the question, any evidence for that? Any way we could know anything about it to shed light on whether it could possibly be true? And I went with Edward T. Martin to India. He had written a book about this called King of Travelers. Researched it for half his life. And with the great good fortune we had of the terrific Hindu team and friends in India, we had access to many places that normally somebody from the West would not have access to. So we were able to actually interview the Shankaracharya of Hinduism, who is like the Pope of Hinduism, if you will, and to go to ancient Hindu temples and speak to the holy men there about what the legends are and why we should believe it. The Buddhist monastery way up in the Himalayas at Ladakh is reported to have a manuscript about those missing years. Well, I sent a team in search of the manuscript. In other words, I looked at every angle, and yet the mainstream, just gets riled up by this kind of speculation. I think Wall Street Journal called the film a caravan of crackpots. Well, that they think that Dalai Lama is a crackpot. Elaine Pagels, the chief biblical scholar of Princeton University, the Shankaracharya. We had so many luminaries, including from the Vatican. But if it's too much on the fringes, the mainstream doesn't respect it. And then we have the same problem, of course, with the Life After Death project. Skeptics lined up waiting to, throw spitballs. But I think I put it together with really respectable scientists.
Yes.
Completely, with so much evidence that that the skeptics have to take it seriously. They have to take notice. And for those who already believe that these things happen and are possible, the communication from afterlife, hearing from a deceased loved one, many people know as part of their consciousness that that's true. It may be as many as 50% of all people. When you ask, one person out of two says they've heard from someone who passed. So those who kind of know it's true, what the book gives to them is just the whole story of how you can make this make sense to people, maybe in your family or friends, who don't understand or who are doubters and just can't open their mind to it, because the book, wouldn't you say it's very logical?
I would. I mean, this is kind of it's one of those books where, I mean, all right, let's go back just a little bit. In the beginning, you started off by saying that since like March 2009, that you've been like intellectually and emotionally challenged by a series of these seemingly inexplicable events that many cases, in many cases people just seem to say, it's utterly impossible with the laws of physics in the world we know, this and that. And that can't be something that's easy to get your head around. And for many people, it would be something that they would hesitate to talk about for fear of ridicule. And so, but there had to come a point that you decided you had to share this information, but then you had to kind of figure out who you were sharing it with and who did you turn to in order to try and make sense out of all that was going on. So when did you let me just say, I turned to many people. I must have turned to 30. I mean, the book and the film are just filled with the expertise and the experiences of the people that I chose who I thought could help me on the quest. But you raise a really good point that, because I'm dealing with things in some cases that are physically impossible. A scientist would say an apport is physically impossible. That's something that just disappears. Or just appears one day, right in plain sight in a very obvious place. Something you misplaced 4 years ago, and there it is right beside your computer one morning, and nobody physically put it there. Things like that. That's an apport. And then there's been the movement of objects where, you're out of the room for a while and something relating to Forrest Ackerman has moved across the room when you come back into it, but there was nobody else there to move it. Right. And then there's the things that kicked it all off. For me, it had to do with ink. Yes. And Forrest was an editor of a magazine, so his whole life was about ink and editing and crossing lines out and changing words around. And he had this great sense of humor where he loved puns. He loved wordplay, twists on words, the play of words, finding names within names. It was part of his character. And his magazine, Famous Monsters, was filled with that in every movie caption, every picture caption, So, his sense of humor, let me just sort of give you a couple of examples. He'd have a picture of a decrepit mummy, rising from a tomb in a pyramid, and he'd say, this guy seems in pretty bad shape, but, that's the way the mummy crumbles. Sorry.
Or he'd say, have you seen my guillotine? He says, I use it quite frequently when I get angry at people, but my mother did tell me not to put all my heads in one basket. Or did you hear the one about the cross-eyed teacher? Well, she couldn't control her pupils. This is humor. Or he would often use this one. He'd say, did you hear about Kraft cheese? That they're opening a new manufacturing plant in the Holy Land. And they're going to call their new product Cheeses of Nazareth. So
I love that kind of humor. I love it. Yeah.
So you get that kind of, the new restaurant that they built on the moon, has good food, but no atmosphere. So, or the dyslexic drunk, who walked into a bra So, he just always had it on the tip of his tongue.
Yeah.
So what happened to me was I was alone in our vacation house about a week after this great tribute we had for Fari. People came in from all over the world for that tribute. They filled every seat in the great Egyptian theater in Hollywood. And people gave talks of praise for Fari and his contribution to the world of movies and science fiction. I was fortunate in being one of the ones who was asked to speak. The whole thing was, I think the main guy that arranged it was Joe Moe, who was Fari's closest caretaker for the last 10 years. Very loyal Hawaiian fellow who lived with Fari and helped him organize all his memorabilia, answer all his correspondence, so that kind of thing. But some great people spoke at the tribute. And Ray Bradbury was there and spoke. Guillermo del Toro spoke about the great influence of Fari. Guillermo said when he was a little boy growing up in Mexico, he wrote Fari a letter saying, "Fari, please, you've got to adopt me." So Fari didn't, but they became friends later in life. And then you had people like Rick Baker, who's won 10 Academy Awards, John Landis, Peter Jackson, checked in by video from
Australia or New Zealand or down under somewhere. Yeah,
down under. It's New Zealand. Yeah. So there's this great tribute, and a week later, I'm alone, 1,000 miles away in vacation house in Santa Fe. The doors are locked. I printed out a document an hour and a half before that I was going to use for going over for tax things, like it listed phone calls, business meetings, business dinners, that kind of stuff you go over for deductions. So 24-page document. So an hour and a half after it was printed, I went down to the printer, picked it up, and it looked normal, of course. The ink was dry, and I tossed it on the bed in the main bedroom. And I was out of the room for about 5 minutes. And this is when the Twilight Zone started for me, Marla. Life hasn't been the same ever since. That moment that I walked back into the room, and I looked at the document, and I saw that on one line, several words had now been blacked out, like an editor, perfectly blacked out. But this isn't water dripping from a ceiling or a leaky pen in the bed. It was exact. The words were chosen. It was precise. It was deliberate. It was clearly some kind of message. And from someone unseen who did it deliberately. So this, Marla, to put it in the crudest terms, this was my first experience of literally being in the presence of a real ghost. It was, well, we've said again and again, defied the laws of science. But what did it mean? Right. See, that's the next question. Of course I was frightened. I was frightened when it happened. But I kept my head about me. And I didn't touch the actual ink with my finger. I regarded it as evidence. It dried a few minutes later. I looked it up to see what the words were, and it took me about, I think it was about a week to catch on to what the message meant and why it would be from Fari, because it used his wordplay of a name within a name, and at first I didn't get it. But later, it did dawn on me. And I realized the meaning of it was a thank you for the tribute. I'd been a speaker at the tribute. It was a way of thanking me as he thanked some other people. He appeared as an apparition to Joe Moe. So harmless, nice, continuation of friendship. Not something from an evil specter or demon,
Just a devilish spirit in a good way.
Yes.
A devilish,
He changed his sense of humor, and it was a matter of weeks. I was on my way taking that document with the ink obliteration, the scientists called it, taking it off to Indiana University, Purdue University, the head of the chemistry department, Dr. J. Siegel. That's when the science adventure began, because Dr. Siegel and his colleagues thought that this is something that they could, figure out quickly using the tools they had available. And then they needed to send me to New Jersey to see Dr. John Allison at the College of New Jersey. He's a chemistry professor there, and he had laser desorption equipment. Suffice it to say that in 3 years of research on the ink blot, they could not find any way to reproduce it. They could not explain how it was done. They learned a lot about the chemistry, but what they learned about the chemistry made it all the more perplexing to them how it ever could have happened. And, you know, in An Atheist in Heaven, Dr. Allison, he's written 2 chapters in the book, but he's written a whole chapter about his chemistry research on the ink blot. And you see in his analysis and in his thinking and the strange things that started to happen to him, you see the evolution of his thinking from somebody who was pretty close-minded and sort of snickered at the idea that, you know, this ink blot at the beginning that would have anything to do with a visitation from beyond the grave. You know, he in the DVD Life After Death Project, you see him, you know, say with a smirk, you know, well, my science doesn't usually require me to bring into the theory action from somebody who's deceased. So, but what happened was so many weird, strange things started happening directly to John Allison that were like the things that happened to me, that over time he grew in his thinking to the point where he accepts that he's a believer now that this was communication. So,
and the interesting thing is, I mean, everything that happens, you can't point that to anybody else but Forrest. I mean, all these, you know, highly unusual synchronicities and everything that he does is so him. You just, you know, you can't say, oh, well, this happened, you know, or blah, blah. No, you know it came from him. And he kind of personalized each thing to each person that received something from him.
Yes. You know, in the book, there's a glossary at the end of 140 paranormal things that we've talked about in the book that probably about 100 of them related to Forrest. And then there's a few other people and spirits that are discussed in the book too, where it's relevant.
Yeah.
But, you know, even recently, weird things have happened. And, you know, the physical things have happened where, for example, you know, one of his favorite movies was The Phantom of the Opera. You know, and he loved that musical. And he had the original makeup kit of Lon Chaney, the actor that played the Phantom. That was part of his collection. So, you know, of course, if something suddenly happens that shouldn't happen, that has to do with the Phantom of the Opera, I'm gonna open my mind to the fact that it could be from Forrest. And there was one particular afternoon where I was with 3 friends of Forrest, and we were talking about him for hours in the afternoon. And I got back into my car where I have an iPod, and I'd been playing Bob Dylan music the whole week. And when I started up the car, it immediately started with the music of the Phantom of the Opera. It starts with this jolting, orchestral, you know, loud music. Bum, ba, 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 ba. You know, it's the way it starts. So I get in the car, I start my car, and I'm suddenly hearing ba, 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 ba. So that's a physical thing. I want to give you 2. We call them like synchronicities because it's just a really improbable coincidence. But 2 things that have just happened like within the last month or 6 weeks. Okay. One is my wife and I went to the premiere of the new Ghostbusters, and this is the Chinese theater in Hollywood. So it's Ghostbusters, it's ghosts, right? So we start talking to the guy who's coincidentally sitting next to my wife, and his name is Ackerman. And he's producing a science fiction movie. And so, so you just say to yourself, okay, what are the odds that that's going to happen? What are the odds?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Or, I think it was last Friday, I went to the Egyptian theater where they show old revival movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And at the beginning of it, somebody from the theater stands up and he says, we have some tickets to the Guillermo del Toro exhibit at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. We're going to give away to whoever can answer this trivia question.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says the trivia question, and it was, what writer sometimes wrote under the pseudonym Laura Jean Ermaine? Well, my hand just shot up. I was the only person in the theater. I said, call on me. It was Forrest J. Ackerman. He's the one that wrote under Laura Jean Ermaine. He would sometimes write what he called lesbian science fiction. And when he did, he was Laura Jean. And so of course, it's an obscure fact. It's not so unusual that I would know that, since I know almost everything about Fari. What's unusual is the fact that of all the thousands of questions they could ask as a trivia question while I'm there, that's the one they ask. Again, you say, what are the odds? So I've got, maybe 40, 50 things in this book where you just say to yourself, what are the odds? And usually, often, those things are followed by some physical event that happens. Like the mask I have of Fari's face that I got at his estate sale, moving across the room on its own, 10 feet. Again, when I'm outside of my home office for about an hour and a half and nobody is there. The mask had been in the same place for years. I had dust. No one touched it. No one went in there. There's no open windows. There's no breezes. Nothing blew it across the room. But I come back and it's moved. And then at that moment, my computer for video editing just suddenly shuts down on its own. Bang, turns off. It shouldn't turn off by itself. Both screens go down. I have 2 editing screens. When I boot back up, and again, this is right after the mask is moved, I boot back up, there's 2 folders open on the screens. Weren't open just a minute ago. One folder is filled with files about Forrest J. Ackerman and photos of him. And the other folder is filled with information about his famous Monsters magazine. So, this starts to look like a guy who's, hungry for publicity even from beyond the grave.
Yeah, and, one of the things that's really, really positive here is that a good paranormal investigator, say, and we have lots of them that listen to the show, what they do is immediately try to disprove evidence instead of, buying into whatever they see. They try to find a logical explanation for some of the bizarre events they come across, and more often not, there always is a mundane reason for these occurrences. But here with you and all the things that go on, some of these things can absolutely not be disproven, like you said about the ink blot. And
Marla, I try, because my natural tendency is skepticism. And I've been dragged into this, kicking and screaming, because I try to explain these things away. I just, life is quieter, or life is easier when you don't have these mysteries hanging over your head. And this is what I said to Dr. J. Siegel when I took the ink blot to him. I said, I will sleep better at night if you can tell me this is something ordinary and you can explain it. And he couldn't. And the weird stuff just started and just kept happening and happening and happening. At John Allison's home, as he's explaining how he's going to research the ink blot, clock in the background on the wall, you could see it beyond his shoulder, is ticking away, and it suddenly chimes. And his face goes white because he says, that shouldn't have done that. That hasn't chimed in years. And he hadn't wound it up in years. What was it doing even ticking? And there were incidents of pages moving in his room that related to his experimentation. There are examples in his laboratory of the laser desorption machine behaving strangely like it never had before and repeatedly trying to shut itself down while one of the desk drawers in front of Dr. Allison kept pushing open into his arm, banging into it, with no explanation for why that would happen. So Look, all I can say is it's all true.
Mm-hmm.
I will be very happy if some of the skeptics will read An Atheist in Heaven, go through it some people, I know how they've read every word in this book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people have read me. They said it's a page turner, couldn't put it down, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, you SOB, I'm trying to get some sleep. I can't sleep. Did you give me this book? So there's that.
Uh-huh.
But, I do want to mention, Marla, my state of mind, you know, before all this started, because I hadn't really thought about this kind of thing since 1983. So that was, 20, a quarter of a century previous to that.
Uh-huh.
I had been a segment producer for F. Lee Bailey, the famous attorney. He had a television show called Lie Detector.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
We'd wire people up to a lie detector who had an interesting story to tell that they wanted their truth to be validated. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the lie detector would show them to have made it up. Mm-hmm. But many times it would show they were telling the truth. Well, one of the people I had brought out from New Jersey, coincidentally, New Jersey again, this is a quarter of a century earlier, than John Allison's involvement. And her name was Allison, and she's also from New Jersey, so I'm seeing more parallels here, right?
There you go.
She was a psychic detective, and she came out with a folder of, it had commendations, letters from police departments, police that she had worked with in solving crimes. Mm-hmm. Now, usually the thing she was able to do was that if there was a missing person and no one could find this person, you know, she could go to the family, touch some articles of their clothing, and then very soon begin to get clues, and she would know whether the person was living or dead. Mm-hmm. And there was a case of a 14-year-old girl who had been murdered. Mm-hmm. And Dorothy Allison said her spirit came to me and gave me all these clues. They took the clues that she gave, which was the visual surroundings of where her body would be found on Long Island. And it took many, many months for the father to find a location that exactly matched all of these clues. Mm-hmm. And they were very specific clues. I mean, she even said, I see the letters M-A-R. And near the location that matched her description, there was a big rock that had graffiti on it with the letters M-A-R spray painted in red. So, wow, she was really getting it. I mean, this stuff can really, really be exact when honing in on you and entering your life. And they did find her body there. Mm-hmm. Not on the first day they found they located the area, but it was still maybe a year after that her body was found in an oil drum at that location. So she said, I'm in touch with spirits. Mm-hmm. It's the deceased person telling me what the clues are, where to look, and she was validated by the lie detector. So at that stage of my life, I'm saying to myself, wow, this really does look real. I would have normally scoffed at something like this, but the evidence is here. So what do we have? We have afterlife, we have spirit reaching out to the living and communicating and conveying important information. So all of that could happen, I had that in my mind from that experience, but 25 years goes by before it happens to me. And when it happens to you, it's no longer an intellectual theory, you see. It's there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like somebody throwing a bucket of cold water in your face. But, you know, when you're talking, and I'm thinking about him on the other side chuckling about all this and being very proud that he can get his point across. But the thing of it is, he did something that the very famous Harry Houdini could not do. And that's another feather in his cap, right? I mean, how many years did they try to do the Houdini seance and they have the secret code word and, you know, nothing happened. But Forrest managed to do it.
It's true. I think the code word was believe, actually.
Yes, yes.
You know, early in the book, I deal with Houdini and someone who was his friend back in those days, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who invented Sherlock Holmes and wrote all the Sherlock Holmes stories. The difference between the two men was that Houdini was an illusionist. He was an escape artist. He was a practicing professional magician who could make people believe they were seeing things that were impossible, but he knew how it was all done. He was doing it. He was escaping from these impossible situations.
Yeah.
He always said, I don't reject out of hand spiritualism, but I've never seen the evidence for it.
Right.
And he said, I do believe that a lot of people are being bilked by charlatans.
And they were, sure. Yeah.
They were, selling them a false faith that they could be helped, charging money or taking donations. And he went to Congress. He tried to get a law passed against psychics being able to provide their services and accept any money.
Right.
So he was on that side of it. But he did set up with his wife a code. They were going to try to communicate, and as you say, in that. But then you've got Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, I have clips of him in the film The Life After Death Project. He says, I don't believe in life after death. He said, I know there is life after death. He says there's a big difference between believing something and knowing something. He had contact from his son, who was a soldier who was killed in World War I. And he had evidence that was as specific and definite as what happened to me. And for people who say, well, I don't understand how you can say that these things are so precise or whatever. I said, look, if somebody comes up to you and says, I know all about you, and you say, oh, you don't know me. What do you know about me? And they say, oh, I know the 10 digits of your main bank account number. You want to hear them? That would get your attention, right?
Sure would, yeah.
Well, Fari gets attention in this way, and eventually Houdini may have made the communication, but in a different way. There are two things that relate to that. One is the fact that on the last day they tried to do a seance to get the word. It only rained in Los Angeles on that day on top of the building where they were trying to hold the seance. It didn't rain.
Knickerbocker Hotel.
That was one thing that happened. Now, the other thing was just a couple of years ago. It was one of the major anniversaries of Houdini's death. And there was a fire in the Magic Castle. That's in Hollywood. We have the Magic Castle, the Academy of Magic Arts, and there's a Houdini seance room there.
Yes, there is.
People dine there. And the fire, there was fire damage, including water damage from the hoses, that went right up to the Houdini seance room, and the damage stopped right there. Didn't go past the doorway.
Yeah.
Didn't go past the doorway. And the firemen, when they declared the fire out, the time coincided with the exact time of Houdini's death.
Wow.
So you have to look to things like that and say, okay, do you want to just believe that that's a coincidence? Again, how many coincidences do you allow for before you have to say something's really going on?
True. I mean, there are a lot of people that will stand firm that none of this is possible and it's all nonsense. But that's the other thing. You didn't just go have, like, Dr. Schwartz help you or the mediums. I mean, you went to so many different people.
Yes.
The scientific world, especially, who usually, doesn't get involved in things like this. But you went to like a handful of people, more than a handful, 30 people, you said, that could help quantify and validate the fact that these things were actually happening. And when you get to that point, I don't care how big a skeptic you are, but when 30 people and respected people, not, just some schlub down the street, but when 30 respected people can validate and quantify what you've done, how do you refute that? I mean, it's just kind of...
You don't, unless you just want to ignore the evidence because it scares you. Because it shakes up your thinking processes too much. There was a sort of comeuppance, if you allow me to describe it that way.
Yeah.
Of Dr. Michael Shermer, who is the executive director of the Skeptics Society, and he's the publisher of Skeptic magazine. And I had him in the Life After Death project in the movie, sort of representing the skeptic point of view. And he said, Paul, he said, don't get me wrong, life after death, I'm for it. I'm not against it. he said, but the thing is, I'm not convinced by any of the evidence that people say they have. And if you have life after death, then don't you have to have life before birth? Gets very complicated. He said, but, maybe someday we'll find out from quantum theory that it can explain this, and then it won't be paranormal. It'll be chapter 25 in your physics book. So that was his comment. But what happened to him was like all these things that happened to me, and it was on his wedding day. And he was so shaken up by it that he wrote an article for Scientific American. It was a September issue. It was, I don't know, maybe it was 2 years ago. September issue of Scientific American. He called it When Something Happens That Shakes Your Skepticism to the Very Core. Now, that is quite a title coming from the executive director of the Skeptics Society. He's had his skepticism shaken to the very core. And I'll tell you very simply what it was. His wife was from Germany, was raised by her grandfather. He's deceased. They ship his things over to Pasadena. They get their marriage license at the courthouse in Pasadena, and they return to Michael's house to have a gathering of people, of friends who've come to see them say their vows publicly. And among the things that had been sent over that had belonged to Grandpa was an old radio that didn't work anymore, and Michael had spent a couple of days trying to make it work. Got out the old soldering gun, did everything he could, and then gave up on it, stuck it in a drawer. Well, let me tell you when it started working again. It was 2 minutes before they said their wedding vows, just after she said, I wish my grandfather were here to give me away. And at that moment, music starts coming from Grandfather's radio, a love song. And it's working. And everybody is aghast. And it works for 24 hours. They don't touch it. They leave it alone for 24 hours. And then after 24 hours, stops working, never works again. Couldn't get it to work. So you see, it's perfect timing. Right. Call it a synchronicity of sorts, but the timing was absolute, precise. She asked for her grandfather. It comes from a radio that belonged to her grandfather. This is where it has that level of specificity that it's like somebody coming up to you and saying, would you like me to tell you 10 numbers of your bank account? Right. So it's just, it's precise. But Michael, he upset a lot of the followers and readers of Skeptic magazine by coming forth with this, saying it shook his skepticism. You're saying, what are you saying now, Michael? You want us to believe that her grandfather made the radio work? And my response to that is, well, yes, of course. Of course. Are you a thinking person or not? Yes, that's what happened. Accept the evidence. So the evidence is there all around us. A lot of people experience it in their own way when someone they love dies. And it's wonderful to come to a point in your life where you accept it, that it's true, that life goes on, that friendships can go on, that we can reach across that veil and they can reach back to us. And we just have to say, we wish it was easier. Wish it wasn't like Morse code of the old days and it was more like, having a cell phone conversation. But it isn't. Not yet.
Not yet, but it could be. And see, this is the thing about the book, too. Whether you're a skeptic, whether you're a believer, whether you're on the fence, this is a book that's going to interest just about anybody that picks it up. Because there's, I guess, the old catchphrase, something for everybody. You may say, okay, well, maybe that, but boy, that one, and you'll go back and forth. So it's well written. I mean, it's like I said validates.
Yeah, someone wrote, I think that there's 23 different reviews of it at Amazon.com right now, and has a very, very high rating there. Yeah. I think one person didn't like it. But someone said there's so much evidence in here pouring at you. He says it's like trying to drink a glass of water, from a fire hose. So, you're getting blasted. So I know we don't have a lot of time, and I would like your listeners, to know, I keep mentioning Amazon.com because it's easy. It's an easy way to get all the things that I've done. I've done like 10 movies, and I think you can find probably almost all of them there. And you can get the titles by looking up Paul Davids, at imdb.com. That's the International Movie Database. Or there's my website. There's pauldavids.com. That's DAVIDS. And there's Paul Davids, and then a hyphen, and then artist.com.
That's right.
And then there's a specific website. There's a lifeafterdeathproject.com. Leave out the word the. It's lifeafterdeathproject.com. And Jesus in India, the movie.com is another one to find out more about Jesus in India. So that's what I do. I pick these topics, or they pick me. In this case, the topic picked me.
Forey picked you. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. And so I don't think that you're going to stop hearing from him ever. Do you?
I hope not. I like to tell him all the time how much I appreciate these contacts and that he's always welcome in my life. His 100th birthday is coming up. It's November 24th. And he would have been 100 years old. He died at age 92. Sometimes I have the fear that maybe that would be like a cutoff point, because he always promised us that he was going to live to 100. And he didn't keep his promise on that. He died at 92. So we say jokingly, his friends say among ourselves, he owed us 8 more years. Well, we've been experiencing those 8 years in so many ways. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to say about that. I know someone who's in the movie Life After Death Project, Lynn Katai, Dr. Lynn Katai, that she heard from her mother many, many times in all kinds of ways on the night that her mother died. All kinds of stuff happened. All hell broke loose. But then she didn't hear from her mother. 10 years went by, and then it was the 10th anniversary of her mother's death, and they went out to get a kitten that was just like the one they used to have. And when they took a Polaroid picture of the new kitten, this is anniversary, 10 years from her mother's death, her mother's spirit appears in the picture holding the cat. Her arms that are transparent are around the cat. And how did she know it was her mother's? Well, her mother had arthritic hands, and the hands in the picture you could see were somewhat misshapen in an arthritic way. So you see, 10 years went by, then she heard from her on a key date. So maybe it kind of works like that, Maybe 25 years go by, and then something happens. An old friend checks in. We just don't know. Maybe time means nothing in the greater scheme of things like that. It's a long time to us, but to them, blink of an eye, I don't know.
It is the great unknown, and that's kind of either causes chagrin or wonder, I mean, I think there's no middle ground here. Either people are just amazed or really annoyed that they can't really get in and know a little bit more.
Marla, I'd want to say, most of the people who are really religious, they feel they can give you answers on these things. They've learned the answers. You live a good life. You don't sin. Right. Hopefully then you go to heaven. And what is heaven? Well, they have descriptions of heaven. I don't know about those descriptions. When we just called this book An Atheist in Heaven, we use the word in its broadest possible sense. We weren't trying to give a Christian definition of heaven. We don't know what it is. Right. It's just that people think of heaven as the place you go to if you don't go to a bad place, after you pass away. And so it's in that sense we said he's now the atheist in heaven. Is heaven right here? I mean, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within you, not some faraway place up in the clouds. It seems like this stuff with the spirits is all happening right here, that they're sharing the same place as us. Right. It's just like all the radio waves, the television waves, the iPhone. You can be inside an elevator using your iPhone. You're in a cage of solid steel, but signals from your iPhone can contact an iPhone, halfway across the world at the same time, at the speed of light. So how does that happen? There's a lot of space between the molecules of steel and waves of information surrounding us, passing through us all the time. I think that's the way it is with the spirit world, that it shares the space with us. It's on a different frequency, and it requires either a talented medium or some kind of instrument or something to help us bridge the two worlds. And I think that's what my life has been the last, since 2009. It's been like a bridging two worlds, not by my choice, but it's been like a spiritual gift. And I think that's pretty much what I've got to say.
Definitely a gift. I agree absolutely that this was a gift and it was meant to be, and it probably most likely will continue. And it would be nice down the line when things come up that you would holler at me, and we'll have you back on to talk about some updates and things that might have changed and be interesting, because this, an hour flies by way too quickly. And we never can get anything all in. But so far, I read the first book. I read the second book. It's kind of a wonderful, and kind of gives everybody hope, that it's not just ashes to ashes and that's it, poof, you're gone.
When you say first book, second book, it's like we have in the one book, we have a book 1 and book 2, because book 2, the part 2 is Gary Schwartz's chapters, where he takes it away at that point. So, and then, of course, the Life After Death Project was the film, and I encourage people to look for it, enjoy it, share it with friends.
It's amazing. And also the book is full of pictures. Both books are full of pictures. So a foray of different things. I know the ink blots in one of the books. So it's good visual eye candy as well as fuel for the brain. Right.
Yeah, lots of pictures in the laboratories, the scientists at work, and all the different people that figured into it. Most of them make an appearance in the book. So it was 3 years of dedication to make it happen. And it exists as a hardback with a dust jacket, and it's also an ebook, so you can get it
on Kindle.
That's what you want to do. Yeah,
perfect. Well, please stay on the line for a couple minutes until I get done saying goodbye to everybody, and I'll thank you properly. And in the meantime, everybody, thank you for tuning in, and until next time, blessed be and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Be sure to tune in next week at this same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2014. Moonlight Hall by Kevin MacLeod, licensed through Incompetech.com.